The knock on the door came at midnight, and Clara Fenwick knew at once that something was wrong. She had not been asleep. She rarely slept well anymore, not since her father's cough had grown worse and the candle money had run low. She pulled her shawl tight and hurried down the narrow stairs of the small rented house, her heart pounding harder with every step. No one came calling at this hour unless it was trouble. She opened the door and found herself looking up into the face of a man she barely knew, though all of London seemed to know his name. Julian Ashby, Duke of Ravenswood, stood on her doorstep in the rain, his coat soaked through, his eyes wild with a kind of desperation she had never seen on a duke before. "Forgive the hour," he said. "I need your help, Miss Fenwick, and I do not have time to ask for it gently." Clara stared at him, too startled to speak. She had met the Duke only once, months before, when he had quietly paid off a debt that would have seen her father thrown into a debtor's prison. He had never explained why he did it. He had never asked for anything in return. She had assumed she would never see him again. "Your Grace," she finally managed. "It is the middle of the night. I am aware." He glanced over his shoulder, as though he feared being followed, then looked back at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My father's will contains a condition I only just learned of tonight. I must be married before tomorrow ends, or I lose everything. The title, the estate, the people who depend on me, all of it passes to my cousin Edmund." Clara blinked. "Married? By tomorrow?" "Yes." "That is not possible." "It is possible," he said. "With a special license and a willing bride, it is entirely possible. I have the license already. What I do not have is a bride." For a long moment, Clara simply looked at him, waiting for him to laugh, to admit this was some strange joke. He did not laugh. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides, and rain dripped steadily from his dark hair onto the stone step between them. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you are the only woman in London I trust not to want me for the wrong reasons," he said. "You did not know who I was when I first met your father. You have never once asked me for anything, though you had every right to. I need a wife who will not scheme against me, and I believe you are that woman." Clara's mind raced. She thought of her father, coughing in the room above them, the doctor's bills piling up faster than she could pay them. She thought of her younger brother and sister, who needed shoes for winter, and food that was not watered-down broth. A marriage to a duke would change everything for her family. But marriage was not a small thing, not even a desperate one. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it will not be for nothing, Your Grace. I have conditions." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. "Name them." "My father's medical care must be paid for, in full, for as long as he lives. My brother and sister must be provided for, given an education, given a future. And I will not be hidden away, or treated as an embarrassment in your household. Whatever this marriage is, I will not be ashamed of it." Julian studied her for a long moment, the rain still falling steadily around them. "Agreed. All of it. And one more thing," Clara said, lifting her chin. "I want the truth. Whatever this is, whatever reason lies beneath your father's condition, I want to know it. I will not walk blind into your world." "You will have the truth," he said, "as much of it as I know myself." Clara's heart pounded. Every sensible thought in her head told her to shut the door, to send this strange, desperate man back into the rain, and forget this had ever happened. But she thought again of her father's cough, of the empty pantry, of the life she had been fighting to hold together, with nothing but stubbornness and worry. This was a door opening, where she had believed there were only walls. "Give me a moment to dress properly," she said, "and to say goodbye to my father, in case he wakes." "There is no time for a long farewell," Julian said gently. "The ceremony must happen before midnight tomorrow, and there is much to arrange before then. A carriage is waiting." Clara nodded, though her hands trembled as she turned to climb the stairs. She dressed quickly in her best gown, plain but clean, and stopped outside her father's door. He was asleep, his breathing rough but steady. She did not wake him. She left a short note on the table instead, promising she would explain everything soon, and that he need never worry about the doctor's bills again. Her younger sister, Alice, stirred as Clara passed her room. "Clara, where are you going?" "I will explain in the morning," Clara whispered. Go back to sleep. Everything is going to be all right. She was not entirely sure she believed her own words, but she said them anyway, because someone needed to be brave in that house, and it had always been her. Downstairs, Julian waited by the door, his expression unreadable. When Clara appeared, dressed and resolute, something in his shoulders eased, as though he had genuinely feared she would refuse him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know this is not the wedding night any woman dreams of." "I stopped dreaming of weddings a long time ago, Your Grace," Clara said. "I have been too busy keeping my family fed." He looked at her then, with something that was not pity, but understanding, and for the first time since he had appeared on her doorstep, Clara felt a small measure of hope that she had not made a terrible mistake. The carriage ride to the church was silent for a long while, the city passing by in dark, rain-streaked windows. Finally, Julian spoke. "My father died believing I was reckless with my inheritance and unwilling to settle down. He wrote his will to force my hand. If I do not marry by my 30th birthday, which is tomorrow, the entire estate passes to my cousin, Edmund." "And your cousin would not manage it well?" Julian's jaw tightened. "My cousin would sell every acre to the highest bidder and turn out every family who has worked that land for generations. He cares for nothing but his own comfort. I have spent years trying to protect the people of Ravenswood from exactly that outcome, and I will not let a single overlooked clause in my father's will hand them over to him." Clara studied his face in the dim carriage light, seeing for the first time the weight he carried, the reason behind the desperation on his doorstep. This was not vanity or convenience. This was a man trying to protect people who depended on him, even at the cost of his own freedom. "Then we understand each other," she said. "You are marrying to protect your people. I am marrying to protect mine." "Yes," Julian said. "Perhaps that is not such a terrible foundation to build upon." Clara said nothing, but she found herself hoping, quietly and carefully, that he was right. The church was small and nearly empty, lit by only a handful of candles when they arrived. A clergyman waited, along with two witnesses Clara did not recognize, servants of the Ravenswood household, she assumed, brought along in haste. There was no music, no flowers, no gathered friends to celebrate, only the soft crackle of candlelight and the steady drum of rain against the windows. Clara stood beside a man she had known for less than a day, about to bind her life to his in front of strangers, and she felt strangely calm. Fear had a way of quieting itself when there was no longer any choice but to move forward. The clergyman began the ceremony, his voice low and solemn. Clara listened to the familiar words, the promises of devotion and loyalty, and found herself meaning them more than she expected to, even under such strange circumstances. When it came time for Julian to speak his vows, his voice was steady, though his eyes, when they met hers, held something raw and unguarded. "I, Julian Ashby, take thee, Clara Fenwick, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Clara repeated her own vows in turn, her voice clear despite the trembling in her hands. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, there was no cheer, no celebration, only the quiet finality of ink drying on a marriage register and two strangers now bound together by law. Julian looked at her, the new Duchess of Ravenswood, and Clara looked back at him, both of them aware that the true difficulty was only just beginning. Whatever waited for them at Ravenswood, whatever secrets lay behind his father's strange will and his cousin's ambitions, they would now face it together, bound not by love, but by necessity, and by the quiet promise each had made to protect the people who depended on them. Outside the church, a second carriage waited, grander than the first, bearing the crest of Ravenswood on its door. Julian helped her inside with careful hands, and for a moment, before he climbed in beside her, Clara caught sight of a figure watching from across the street. A tall man in a dark coat, standing perfectly still despite the rain, his eyes fixed on the church doors. When he saw her looking, he did not turn away. He simply watched, unblinking, until the carriage door closed between them. "Who was that man?" Clara asked, once they had settled inside and the carriage began to move. Julian followed her gaze through the window, but the street was already empty. "What man?" "Across from the church. Tall, dark coat. He was watching us." Julian's expression darkened, though he tried to mask it. "That would have been my cousin's man. Edmund keeps eyes on me more often than I would like. He must have learned of the wedding already. How could he know so quickly? I do not know, Julian admitted. But it troubles me that he does. Clara said nothing more, though a small knot of unease settled in her stomach. She had agreed to marry a stranger, to save her family, and already there were shadows gathering at the edges of the arrangement, questions she did not yet have answers to. She thought of the promise Julian had made her, that she would have the truth, and she resolved to hold him to it. The carriage rattled on through the waking city, past shop fronts just beginning to open their shutters, past a milkmaid delivering her morning rounds, past all the ordinary business of a world that had no idea a marriage had just quietly rearranged the fate of an entire estate. Clara watched it all pass by the window, feeling strangely detached from her own life, as though she were watching someone else's story unfold. Beside her, Julian was quiet, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I know I have asked a great deal of you, Clara. More than any stranger has the right to ask. But I promise you this. Whatever comes next, I will not let harm reach you or your family, not while I have breath to prevent it. Clara turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of falsehood, and found none. I intend to hold you to that promise, Your Grace. Julian, he said quietly, if we are to be husband and wife, you may at least use my name. Julian, she repeated, testing the sound of it. It felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for a man she had known less than a full day, and yet somehow, it also felt like the beginning of something she could not yet name. The carriage rolled on toward the edge of the city, toward Ravenswood, toward whatever waited for them there. Clara did not know yet what dangers, what secrets, or what unexpected tenderness the estate would hold. She knew only that there was no turning back now, and that whatever came next, she would meet it with the same steady resolve that had carried her through every hardship before this one. The gates of Ravenswood rose out of the morning mist like something out of a dream Clara had never dared to have. Stone pillars, carved with the family crest, stretched high above the carriage as it rolled through onto a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees. Beyond them, the house itself came into view, vast and gray, with rows of tall windows catching the pale morning light. Clara's chest tightened. This was no longer a story happening to someone else. This was her home now, whether she felt ready for it or not. It is a great deal to take in, Julian said quietly, watching her reaction. I remember the first time I truly understood how large this place was. I was 7, and I got lost for nearly 2 hours looking for the kitchens. Clara managed a small smile despite her nerves. I do not think I will be looking for the kitchens today. I suspect I will be looking for a place to hide. There is no need to hide, Julian said. Whatever the staff think, whatever anyone thinks, you are the Duchess of Ravenswood now. That is not a title anyone can take from you. Clara appreciated the sentiment, though she doubted it would make the coming hours any easier. The carriage rolled to a stop before the great front steps, where a line of servants had already gathered, standing in neat rows despite the early hour. At their head stood an older woman with silver hair, pulled back severely, her expression unreadable, and beside her, a tall man with sharp eyes, who did not bother to hide his curiosity. That is Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, Julian murmured as the carriage door opened, and beside her, my cousin Edmund. Clara's stomach dropped. She had not expected to meet him so soon, not after learning he had already sent a man to watch the wedding. She straightened her spine and stepped down from the carriage, with as much composure as she could manage, determined not to let her nerves show. Your Grace, Mrs. Whitfield said, bowing her head toward Julian before turning her sharp gaze on Clara, and this must be the new Duchess. Clara, Julian said, may I present Mrs. Whitfield, who has run this household longer than I have been alive, and my cousin, Edmund Ashby. Edmund stepped forward, his smile thin and practiced. How wonderful. A wedding I was not even told about, until it was already finished. You move quickly, cousin. The circumstances required speed, Julian said evenly, as you well know, given the terms of my father's will. Of course, Edmund said, his eyes sliding over Clara, with a look that made her skin crawl, though she could not say exactly why. And where did you find such a lovely bride, hidden away all this time? That is not your concern, Julian said, his voice sharpening. Edmund's smile did not waver, but something cold flickered behind his eyes before he turned it back into polite amusement. "Forgive me. I only meant to welcome her properly. Welcome to Ravenswood, Duchess. I do hope you find it everything you were promised." There was something in the way he said it, some subtle edge beneath the courteous words, that made Clara certain he did not believe this marriage would last. She held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. "Thank you," she said simply. "I am certain I will find it very interesting indeed." Something flickered across Edmund's face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of respect, before he inclined his head and stepped back to let Mrs. Whitfield take over the formal welcome. The housekeeper led Clara through the introductions that followed, a long line of maids, footmen, and household staff, each offering a curtsy or a bow, each studying her with barely concealed curiosity. Clara did her best to remember names, to smile warmly, to seem like a woman who belonged in such a grand house, though inside, she felt every bit the imposter she feared she might appear to be. When the introductions finally ended, Mrs. Whitfield led her inside, through a grand entrance hall with a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into shadow, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her every step. "Your rooms have been prepared, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, her tone carefully neutral. "Though I confess, we had very little notice to prepare them properly. I am sure whatever has been arranged will be more than sufficient," Clara said. "I do not require luxury, Mrs. Whitfield. I require only honesty and a fair chance to prove myself capable of this role." The housekeeper paused at that, studying Clara with new interest. That is not what most young ladies say upon arriving at a duke's estate. "I am not most young ladies," Clara said simply. A faint, almost approving smile touched the older woman's lips before she resumed her brisk pace down the corridor. "No, I do not suppose you are." Clara's rooms, when she finally reached them, were grander than anything she had ever slept in. A wide bed, draped in pale blue silk, tall windows overlooking rolling gardens, a private sitting room with a fireplace already lit against the morning chill. She stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely small, and thought of the narrow, cold room she had left behind in London, of her father coughing through the night, of Alice and her brother sharing a single blanket to stay warm. A knock sounded at her door. Julian stood there, no longer in his soaked coat from the night before, but dressed simply, his expression careful. "I wanted to see that you were settled," he said, "and to tell you that a physician has already been sent to attend your father this morning, as promised, along with arrangements for your brother and sister." Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly that her eyes stung with unexpected tears.
"Thank you,"
she whispered.
"Truly. You kept your part of our agreement."
Julian said, "I intend to keep mine, fully and without delay." Clara studied him for a long moment, this strange, careful man who had upended her entire life in a single night, and found herself grateful, despite everything, that fate had led her to his doorstep rather than someone else's. "Your cousin," she said carefully. "He does not seem pleased by our marriage." Julian's expression tightened. Edmund has spent years assuming this estate would eventually fall to him. He will not accept losing it easily. "I would ask you to be cautious around him, Clara. He is clever, and he does not lose gracefully." "I noticed," Clara said. "He watched the church last night, or had someone watch it for him." "Yes," Julian admitted. "That troubles me more than I have said. I do not yet know how he learned of the wedding so quickly, nor what he intends to do with that knowledge." Clara felt the same unease she had noticed in the carriage returning, a quiet warning that this marriage, whatever else it might become, was not without real danger. "Then we should be careful together," she said, "rather than each carrying our worries alone." Julian looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, though he said nothing to name it. "I would like that," he said finally. "It has been a long time since I had anyone to share the weight of this place with." Over the following days, Clara settled slowly into the rhythms of Ravenswood. She rose early, before most of the household stirred, and walked the gardens alone, learning the paths between the hedges and fountains. She spent hours with Mrs. Whitfield, learning the running of such a vast household, insisting on understanding every detail rather than simply issuing orders she did not comprehend. The staff, wary at first, began to warm to her steady, practical manner. so different from the cold formality they had perhaps expected from a duchess. Julian, for his part, remained largely occupied with estate business, closeted for long hours with his steward and solicitors, though he always made time each evening to dine with her, the two of them alone, in a smaller, warmer room than the grand formal dining hall, speaking of small things, the weather, the gardens, the books in the estate's vast library, carefully avoiding anything that touched too closely on the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Edmund, meanwhile, remained a constant, unsettling presence, appearing at odd hours, offering comments laced with subtle barbs, watching Clara with an attention that made her deeply uneasy. She began to notice, too, the way certain servants grew quiet whenever his name was mentioned, the way Mrs. Whitfield's expression tightened whenever he entered a room. One afternoon, while exploring the estate's library in search of a book to occupy a quiet hour, Clara came across an old portrait tucked away in a forgotten corner, half hidden behind a heavy curtain. It showed a young woman, beautiful and pale, dressed in the fashion of perhaps a decade before, her eyes carrying a sadness that seemed to reach across the years. "Who is this?" Clara asked Mrs. Whitfield, who had come to find her for the evening meal. The housekeeper's face grew guarded. "That is Lady Eleanor Vance, Your Grace. She was once engaged to the Duke, some years past." Clara's heart quickened with sudden curiosity. "What happened to her?" "That," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully, "is a story that is not mine to tell. I would suggest asking His Grace, if you truly wish to know. Though I will say this much, it is not a story he speaks of easily." Clara looked back at the painting, at the sad, haunting eyes of the woman who had once nearly become Duchess of Ravenswood, and felt the first thread of a mystery she knew she would not be able to leave alone. That evening, over a quiet dinner of roasted pheasant and buttered vegetables, Clara found herself watching Julian more closely than usual, searching his face for some trace of the sorrow Mrs. Whitfield's words had hinted at. He noticed her studying him, and set down his fork. "You have that look again," he said, "the one that means you are turning something over in your mind." Clara hesitated only a moment before deciding honesty served them both better than careful silence. "I found a portrait today, in the library, of a woman named Eleanor Vance." Julian's hand stilled on the table. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Clara wondered if she had made a mistake in raising it so directly. Then he exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though not all of it. "Eleanor and I were engaged, many years ago," he said. "Before my father died, before any of this. What happened? The engagement ended," he said, his voice carefully flat. "Badly, and rather suddenly. I do not enjoy discussing it, Clara, and I hope you will forgive me if I do not tonight. It is not a wound that has fully healed, even after all this time." Clara studied him, aware of the walls rising behind his eyes, walls she had no right yet to ask him to lower. "I will not press you," she said gently, "but I would ask one thing. If it ever touches upon us, upon this marriage, upon anything Edmund might use against you, I would ask that you tell me. I cannot help protect what I do not understand." Something in Julian's expression softened at that, a flicker of gratitude beneath the guardedness. "That is fair," he said. "I promise you, if it becomes relevant, you will be the first to know." They finished the meal in companionable quiet after that, though Clara noticed he ate less than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. Later, as she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not of the mysterious Eleanor, but of the rare vulnerability she had glimpsed in Julian's face, a crack in the composed, dutiful man he presented to the world. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm. Clara continued learning the running of the household, growing more confident with each passing week, earning small nods of approval from Mrs. Whitfield that felt like victories. She wrote regularly to her father, delighted to learn from his replies that his health was already improving under the physician's care, that Alice had begun lessons with a proper tutor, that her brother had new boots for the coming winter. Every letter brought fresh relief, proof that whatever else this strange marriage might bring, she had already kept her family safe. Edmund, however, remained a shadow at the edges of her new life. He appeared at meals uninvited more often than not, filling silences with pointed questions about Clara's family, her upbringing, her past, questions that felt less like curiosity and more like careful searching for weaknesses. Clara learned to answer him with calm, unbothered honesty, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be hunting for, though it cost her more effort than she let show. One evening, as she crossed the west corridor toward her rooms, she overheard Edmund's voice drifting from a half-open study door, low and urgent, speaking to someone she could not see. The marriage will not survive scrutiny, not once certain facts come to light. Patience. This will unravel on its own, and I intend to be standing there when it does. Clara froze in the corridor, her pulse quickening. She did not know who he was speaking to, nor precisely what facts he meant, but the certainty in his voice sent a cold chill through her. She moved quietly away before she could be discovered listening, her mind racing through everything she had learned since arriving at Ravenswood, the sad portrait in the library, Julian's guarded silence about his broken engagement, Edmund's constant, probing presence. Whatever secret lay buried in this house, she was now certain of one thing. Edmund already knew it, and he intended to use it. Clara did not sleep well that night. Edmund's words echoed through her mind, over and over, until she finally rose before dawn and dressed in the gray half-light, determined to find some answers of her own, even if Julian was not yet ready to give them. She made her way back to the library, to the forgotten corner, where Eleanor Vance's portrait hung behind its heavy curtain. In the pale morning light, the painted face seemed even sadder than before, the eyes carrying a weight Clara now suspected held the key to whatever Edmund was so eager to unearth. She searched the shelves nearby, uncertain what she was even looking for, until her fingers brushed against a slim leather journal, tucked behind a row of larger books, its cover worn soft with age. She opened it carefully and found handwriting she recognized at once from the notes Julian occasionally left for the household staff, careful and precise. It was his journal, from years before. Clara knew she should close it, should respect the privacy he was owed, and yet Edmund's threatening words from the night before pushed her forward. She told herself she was only trying to protect their marriage, to understand the danger circling them, and turned the pages until she found an entry dated years earlier, not long before what she now understood must have been the end of his engagement to Eleanor. The words were sparse, clearly written by a man in pain, but the meaning was clear enough. Eleanor had ended their engagement suddenly, without explanation, only weeks before the wedding was to take place. Julian had written of his confusion, his hurt, his suspicion that something had happened to change her mind, that she refused to name. There was mention of a letter Eleanor had received shortly before breaking things off, a letter Julian never saw, but one he suspected had come from within his own family. Clara closed the journal slowly, her mind turning over the implications. If Edmund had somehow interfered in that first engagement, if he had sent that mysterious letter to drive Eleanor away, it would mean this was not the first time he had worked to secure the title for himself. It would mean he was capable of far more than simple scheming from the shadows. You should not be reading that. Clara startled, turning to find Julian standing in the library doorway, his expression unreadable. She had not heard him enter. I am sorry, she said, setting the journal carefully back on the shelf. I should not have looked. But Julian, I overheard your cousin last night, speaking of facts that would unravel our marriage. I fear he means to use whatever happened with Eleanor against us. Julian's face paled slightly, and he crossed the room to sit heavily in a nearby chair. What exactly did you hear? Clara repeated Edmund's words as precisely as she could remember them. Julian listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly together, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Eleanor ended our engagement 3 weeks before the wedding, he said finally. She gave no reason, only that she could not marry me. I was devastated and confused, and it took me years to stop wondering what I had done wrong. I never learned the truth of it. I found mention of a letter, Clara said gently. One you suspected came from within your family. Julian nodded slowly. I always suspected Edmund had some hand in it, though I could never prove it. He benefited most from the broken engagement, after all. Without a wife, I could not yet fully claim my inheritance in my own right, and Edmund used those years to strengthen his own position within the family, to make himself indispensable to my father, in ways I was too grief-stricken to counter. Do you think he would do the same now? Try to break this marriage the way he broke that one? I think, Julian said grimly, that my cousin will use whatever weapon is available to him, and if he believes there is some way to convince others that our marriage is illegitimate or built on false pretenses, he will pursue it without hesitation. Clara felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the library. Then we must be prepared. We must know what he intends before he acts, rather than simply waiting to be surprised by it. Julian studied her, something like admiration flickering behind the worry in his eyes. You are remarkably steady for a woman who has been thrown into the middle of all this with barely any warning. I have spent years managing crises with very little warning, Clara said simply. This is only a larger one than most. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. I am beginning to understand why I trusted my instincts that night on your doorstep. Over the following days, Clara and Julian grew closer, in ways neither of them had anticipated, when they first exchanged vows in that quiet, candlelit church. They began sharing meals, not out of obligation, but genuine preference, lingering afterward in the smaller sitting room, talking long into the evening about everything and nothing, the books they had loved as children, the small joys and frustrations of running such a vast estate, the quiet dreams each had carried before circumstances forced them onto this unexpected path together. Clara found herself looking forward to these evenings more than she wanted to admit, found herself noticing the way Julian's careful reserve softened when he laughed, the way his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than strict necessity required. She told herself it meant nothing, that gratitude and proximity were easily mistaken for deeper feeling, and yet the warmth that spread through her chest whenever he smiled at her told a different story. Julian, for his part, found himself equally unsettled by the shift taking place within him. He had entered this marriage expecting a practical arrangement, a solution to a legal problem, nothing more. He had not expected to find himself thinking of Clara throughout the long hours he spent with his steward, had not expected to catch himself smiling at some memory of something clever she had said the evening before. He had not expected, after years of guarding his heart so carefully following Eleanor's betrayal, to feel it stirring again, cautiously, toward the steady, remarkable woman who had agreed to marry him on a single night's notice. Yet even as their bond deepened, Edmund's shadow continued to fall across Ravenswood. Clara noticed him watching them both with growing frequency, his expression calculating whenever he observed their easy laughter over dinner, their quiet conversations in the garden. She began to sense that their growing closeness troubled him more than the marriage itself had, as though he had expected the arrangement to remain cold and distant, easy to exploit, and was now recalculating his approach in the face of something he had not anticipated. One afternoon, while walking the gardens with Mrs. Whitfield, discussing preparations for an upcoming gathering of local families, Clara noticed Edmund deep in conversation with a stranger near the estate's outer wall, a man she did not recognize, dressed plainly, but carrying himself with a kind of careful watchfulness that reminded her uncomfortably of the figure who had watched their wedding from across the street. "Who is that man Edmund is speaking with?" Clara asked quietly. Mrs. Whitfield followed her gaze, and something tightened in the older woman's expression. "I do not recognize him, Your Grace, though I confess, Mr. Ashby has had a number of unfamiliar visitors these past weeks, more than is his usual habit." "Should we be concerned?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I have served this family for many years, Your Grace, through good times and difficult ones alike. I will say only this. Mr. Edmund Ashby has never been a man content to wait patiently for what he believes should be his. I would advise both you and His Grace to remain watchful." Clara took the warning to heart, and that evening, she relayed the encounter to Julian, who listened with a deepening frown. "I have noticed the same," he admitted. "Increased correspondence, visitors I do not recognize, meetings conducted with unusual secrecy. I have asked my solicitor to look into Edmund's recent activities, discreetly, but so far we have found nothing definitive." "Perhaps we should be more direct," Clara suggested, rather than waiting for him to strike first. "What did you have in mind?" Clara considered carefully before answering. "You said Eleanor received a letter before ending your engagement, one you never saw. If that letter still exists somewhere, if we could find proof of Edmund's involvement in that first betrayal, it would remove any credibility he might claim now. It would show the pattern of his scheming clearly enough that no one in society could take his accusations seriously." Julian's expression turned thoughtful. "Eleanor married shortly after our engagement ended. Lord Pemberton, if I recall correctly. She lives now at his estate, not more than half a day's ride from here. Then perhaps, Clara said carefully, it is time you spoke with her. Not to reopen old wounds, but to finally understand what truly happened all those years ago. Julian was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the prospect of confronting a past he had spent years trying to bury. Finally, he nodded slowly. You are right. I have avoided this conversation for far too long, out of pride or fear, or perhaps simply because it was easier not to know. But if Edmund intends to use our marriage the way he once used my engagement to Eleanor, I owe it to us, to everyone at Ravenswood, to finally uncover the truth. Then we will go together, Clara said firmly. Whatever we find, we will face it together. Julian looked at her, something profound and unguarded passing across his features, and for a moment, Clara forgot entirely about Edmund, about the danger circling them, about everything, except the steady warmth building quietly between them. Together, he agreed softly. I find I rather like the sound of that. They departed for Pemberton's estate 2 days later, the carriage winding through green countryside, beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Clara watched the passing fields, her thoughts a tangle of nerves and determination, aware that whatever they learned from Eleanor could either strengthen their position against Edmund or complicate it in ways neither of them could yet predict. Beside her, Julian was quiet, his hands restless in his lap, and Clara reached over, without quite deciding to, resting her hand gently over his. He looked at her, startled by the small gesture, before his fingers curled around hers, holding on, as though her steady presence was the only thing keeping his composure intact. Whatever she tells you, Clara said softly, it does not change who you are now, Julian. It does not change the man who has spent years protecting the people who depend on him, who kept every promise he made me without hesitation, who has shown me nothing but honesty and care since the moment he appeared on my doorstep. Julian's grip on her hand tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. I do not know what I would have done, facing all of this alone. I am deeply grateful, Clara, that I do not have to. The carriage rolled on toward Pemberton's estate, toward answers neither of them could yet predict, and Clara found herself hoping, with a fierceness that surprised her, that whatever they uncovered would draw them closer together, rather than tear apart the fragile, unexpected bond that had grown between them. Pemberton's estate came into view as the afternoon light softened into gold, a smaller, more modest house than Ravenswood, surrounded by neat rows of rose bushes just beginning to bloom. Lady Eleanor Pemberton met them in her drawing room, and Clara found herself studying the woman from the portrait, older now, though the sadness in her eyes remained unmistakably the same. Julian, Eleanor said softly, rising to greet them. I did not expect to see you again, especially not with your new bride at your side. Congratulations are in order, I believe. Thank you, Julian said, his voice careful. Eleanor, this is Clara, my wife. Clara, Lady Eleanor Pemberton. The two women exchanged polite greetings, though Clara sensed a current of old sorrow running beneath Eleanor's composed manner. Once they were seated, tea served by a quiet maid, Julian did not waste time on further pleasantries. I have come to ask you something I should have asked years ago, he said. Why did you end our engagement, Eleanor? What truly happened? Eleanor's hands stilled around her teacup, and for a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the drawing-room window. Finally, she set the cup down with careful precision. I received a letter, she said quietly, 3 weeks before our wedding. It claimed you had fathered a child with a servant girl, and that you intended to continue the arrangement quietly, even after our marriage. It included details I had no reason to doubt at the time. Names, dates, even a supposed confession from the girl herself. Julian went rigid beside Clara, his face draining of color. That is a lie. Every word of it. I understand that now, Eleanor said gently. I did not understand it then. I was young and frightened, and the letter seemed so certain, so detailed, that I could not bring myself to risk marrying a man capable of such deception. I ended our engagement rather than confront you directly, because I did not trust myself not to be swayed by your denial, whether it was true or false. Do you still have the letter? Clara asked, leaning forward. Eleanor's gaze shifted to her, considering. I kept it, for many years, though I could not say precisely why. Perhaps some part of me always wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. She rose and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, retrieving a folded, yellowed piece of paper from a locked drawer. I have never shown this to anyone. I did not see the purpose in reopening old wounds. But if it helps you now, you are welcome to it. Julian took the letter with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. Clara watched his expression shift from confusion to dawning, furious recognition as he studied the handwriting. "This is Edmund's hand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I would know it anywhere. He wrote this." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Your cousin? I had no idea. I never considered that anyone within your own family might wish to see our engagement fail." "He had every reason to," Julian said grimly. "Without a wife, my inheritance remained tied up in ways that allowed him greater influence over my father's decisions. He must have written this letter to ensure our engagement collapsed, knowing precisely how to craft something believable enough to convince you." Clara felt a fierce, protective anger rising in her chest, not only for Julian, whose years of quiet grief suddenly made painful new sense, but for Eleanor, who had spent years believing herself the victim of Julian's supposed betrayal, when in truth, she had been nothing more than a pawn in Edmund's careful scheming. "I am so sorry," Eleanor said quietly, tears gathering in her eyes. "If I had confronted you directly, if I had trusted enough to ask rather than simply believe." "You could not have known," Julian said, his anger tempering into something gentler as he looked at her. "Edmund is skilled at exactly this kind of deception. I do not blame you, Eleanor. I am only grateful to finally understand the truth, after all these years." Clara reached for Julian's hand once more, steadying him as she felt the tension radiating from his frame. "This letter," she said carefully, "proves a clear pattern. If Edmund is willing to fabricate lies to destroy one engagement, he is certainly capable of scheming against this marriage as well. We must use this carefully, but we now have real evidence of exactly what kind of man we are dealing with." Julian nodded slowly, folding the letter with careful reverence, as though it were both a wound finally understood and a weapon he now possessed. "Thank you, Eleanor. Truly, I know this cannot have been an easy thing to revisit." "I only wish I had known the truth sooner," Eleanor said. "Perhaps things might have turned out differently for both of us." Her gaze moved briefly to Clara, and something like genuine warmth softened her expression. "Though I confess, Julian, watching you with your wife just now, I do not believe things could have turned out better than this. You look at her the way I always hoped someone would look at me." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, and beside her, Julian did not deny it, only tightened his grip gently around her hand. They left Pemberton's estate as the sky darkened toward evening, the letter safely tucked away in Julian's coat, proof at last of the danger they faced, and the lengths Edmund was willing to go, to secure what he believed was rightfully his. The carriage ride home was quieter than the journey out, both of them absorbed in the weight of what they had learned, though Clara noticed Julian's hand never quite let go of hers, as though he needed the steady reminder that she remained beside him through it all. "Whatever comes next," Julian said finally, as the first lights of Ravenswood came into view through the darkening countryside. "I am glad it is you standing with me, Clara. I do not think I could face this with anyone else." Clara looked at him, at the man who had arrived at her doorstep, a desperate stranger, and had since become something far more essential to her than she had ever expected, and felt the truth settle quietly and certainly in her chest. "There is nowhere else I would rather stand," she said softly, and meant it entirely. The invitation arrived 3 days after their return from Pemberton's estate, thick cream paper bearing the seal of Lord and Lady Ashcombe, announcing a grand gathering to be held at their nearby estate, the first significant social event since Clara's sudden marriage had become known throughout the county. Julian studied the invitation with a frown. "We do not have to attend," he said. "Given everything with Edmund, perhaps it would be wiser to remain quietly at Ravenswood a while longer." "No," Clara said firmly. "If we hide away, it will only feed whatever rumors Edmund intends to spread. We should attend, and we should do so with confidence. Let society see a duke and duchess who have nothing to fear." Julian studied her, a flicker of admiration crossing his features. "You continue to surprise me, Clara. Very well, we shall attend together." The evening of the gathering arrived clear and cool, the Ashcombe estate blazing with candlelight as carriages rolled up the long drive, delivering London's finest families in silks and jewels. Clara wore a gown of deep blue, simple but elegant, and felt Julian's steady presence beside her as they entered the grand ballroom, aware of the curious eyes that turned toward them, whispers rippling through the crowd at the sight of the mysterious new Duchess of Ravenswood. They had barely made their way through the initial round of greetings when Edmund appeared, resplendent in an impeccably tailored coat, his smile as polished and cold as ever. "Cousin," he said, bowing slightly toward Julian, before turning his attention to Clara. "Duchess, how wonderful to see you both looking so well. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Edmund," Julian said evenly, though Clara could feel the tension radiating from him. "I do hope you will forgive me," Edmund continued, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "But I confess, I have been rather curious about the swift nature of your union. Such haste is unusual, even for matters of the heart." Clara felt eyes turning toward them, conversations quieting as people strained to hear. She recognized the trap immediately, Edmund seeking to plant seeds of doubt in a public setting, where Julian could not easily defend himself without appearing defensive. "Circumstances required speed," Julian said carefully, "as I am certain you are already aware." "Of course," Edmund said, his smile widening. "Though I confess, I have heard the most curious rumor, that the marriage documents themselves may not have been entirely in order. Something about the special license being obtained under questionable circumstances. I am sure it is nothing, merely idle gossip, but you know how quickly such things can spread." Clara's heart pounded, understanding now precisely what Edmund intended. He meant to plant doubt about the legitimacy of their marriage itself, publicly, subtly, in a way designed to spread through society like wildfire regardless of its truth. "There is nothing irregular about our marriage," Julian said, his voice hard, despite his obvious effort to remain composed. "I would advise you to be careful about the rumors you choose to repeat, Edmund." "I only repeat what I hear," Edmund said, spreading his hands in mock innocence. "Though I did happen to obtain a copy of the special license in question, and I confess, certain details do seem rather irregular upon closer inspection. The witness signatures, for instance, seem somewhat inconsistent with the household staff I know to be employed at Ravenswood." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to listen, and Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her, the careful confidence she had walked in with beginning to waver. She glanced at Julian and saw genuine alarm flickering behind his controlled expression. "That is a lie," Julian said, though his voice carried less certainty than before, clearly caught off guard by the specificity of the accusation. "Perhaps," Edmund said smoothly, "or perhaps not. I am certain the matter will sort itself out, given time and proper scrutiny, though I do wonder how the courts might view such irregularities, should they ever come to light." He offered a shallow bow and melted back into the crowd, leaving whispers spreading in his wake like ripples across still water. Clara felt sick, watching curious, calculating glances turn toward them from every corner of the ballroom. "He has forged something," Julian said quietly, once they had found a moment of relative privacy near the edge of the room. "I do not know what precisely, but he clearly intends to claim our marriage was conducted improperly." "Can he actually prove such a claim?" "I do not know," Julian admitted, and for the first time since Clara had met him, she heard genuine uncertainty in his voice. The witnesses that night were hastily gathered. If Edmund has somehow tampered with the documentation, or bribed someone to claim irregularities, it could create enough doubt to warrant a formal inquiry. Clara's mind raced, fear and determination warring within her. "Then we return home tonight, and we examine everything ourselves. The license, the register, every document connected to that night. We find the truth before Edmund can twist it into something false." They departed the gathering earlier than propriety strictly allowed, murmurs following them out the door, and the carriage ride home passed in tense, worried silence. Once back at Ravenswood, Julian retrieved every relevant document from his study, laying them across the desk with careful, methodical precision, while Clara reviewed each page alongside him, searching for anything that might have been altered or falsified. "Here," Julian said finally, pointing to the witness signatures on the marriage register. "These names, I do not recognize them as any of the staff who were actually present that night." Clara leaned closer, studying the unfamiliar signatures. Someone has changed the record, or created a false copy to circulate. Edmund, Julian said grimly. He must have gained access to the original documents, or bribed the clergyman who performed the ceremony to alter his records after the fact. A cold, sinking dread settled in Clara's stomach. If he has truly falsified the official register, this could become far more serious than mere gossip. It could genuinely threaten the legitimacy of our marriage in the eyes of the law. Julian's jaw tightened, his hands clenched against the desk. I will not let him take this from us, from you. Whatever it requires, I will find proof of his deception. But even as he spoke the words with fierce determination, Clara noticed something new in his eyes when he looked at her, a flicker of doubt that had not been there before, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. Julian, she said carefully, you do not believe I had any part in this, do you? No, he said quickly, too quickly perhaps, and Clara felt the sting of that hesitation despite his immediate denial. Of course not. But the small silence before his answer lingered between them, a crack forming in the trust they had so carefully built over the preceding weeks. Clara felt a wave of hurt she had not expected, sharp and unwelcome. You hesitated, she said quietly. After everything, after Eleanor's letter, after everything we uncovered together about Edmund's schemes, you still hesitated. Clara, I did not mean. I understand the pressure you are under, she said, rising from her chair, her voice carefully controlled, despite the ache spreading through her chest. I understand. Edmund has spent years perfecting the art of doubt and deception, but I will not stand here and be doubted by the one person I believed truly trusted me. She left the study before he could respond further, retreating to her rooms. With tears she refused to let fall, until the door was firmly closed behind her. She had known, rationally, that trust built in a matter of weeks remained fragile, easily shaken by clever enough manipulation. But some part of her had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that what had grown between them was stronger than Edmund's careful poison. She spent that night alone, sleep elusive, her mind turning over every possibility, every way Edmund might have orchestrated this latest scheme, and slowly, beneath the hurt, a fierce resolve began to take shape. She would not simply wait for Julian to sort through his doubts. She would find proof of Edmund's deception herself, and she would do it without needing anyone's trust restored first, because she had learned long ago that the surest way through a crisis was never to wait passively for rescue. The following morning, before the household had fully woken, Clara dressed quietly and made her way toward the village church where their hasty wedding had taken place, determined to speak with the clergyman directly and learn precisely what Edmund might have done to alter the official records. She found the elderly clergyman tending his small garden behind the church, and he greeted her with evident surprise. Your Grace, he said, straightening with some effort. I did not expect a visit so early. Forgive the intrusion, Clara said. I need to ask you something important, Father. About the night of my wedding, and the witnesses who signed our register. The clergyman's expression grew troubled. A gentleman came to see me. Several days passed. Your husband's cousin, I believe. He asked to review the register, claiming some minor clerical concern needed addressing. I saw no reason to refuse him, given his connection to the family. Clara's pulse quickened. Did he alter anything? Did you see him make any changes? I did not watch him closely, I confess, the clergyman admitted, clearly uncomfortable. He asked for a few private moments with the book, claiming he wished to verify certain family details for the estate records. I did not think to question a member of such an esteemed family. Father, Clara said carefully, I believe he may have tampered with the official record of our marriage. This is extremely important. Do you keep any earlier copy, any original notes made the night of the ceremony itself, before whatever he may have altered? The clergyman's eyes widened with sudden understanding, and he gestured for her to follow him inside the small church. I do keep a personal ledger, separate from the official register, where I record every ceremony I perform, purely for my own records. I have kept such a practice for over 30 years. If anything was altered in the official book, my private ledger would remain untouched. Hope surged through Clara as she followed him to a small back room, where he retrieved a worn, leather-bound ledger from a locked cabinet and flipped carefully through its pages, until he found the entry corresponding to their wedding night. There, in his own careful handwriting, were the true names of the witnesses who had actually stood present that night. 2 footmen from Ravenswood, whom Clara now recognized clearly from her early days at the estate. This proves it, Clara breathed, relief and vindication flooding through her in equal measure. This proves the official register has been falsified. I would be glad to testify to its accuracy, should it become necessary, the clergyman said gravely. Tampering with official church records is a serious matter, Your Grace, regardless of the family name behind it. Clara thanked him profusely and hurried back toward Ravenswood, the precious ledger entry copied carefully into her own notes, her mind already racing ahead to how this evidence, combined with Eleanor's letter, might finally be enough to expose Edmund's schemes once and for all. Whatever doubt had passed through Julian's eyes the night before, she intended to return not as a woman wounded by his hesitation, but as the one who had solved the very crisis threatening to tear them apart. She arrived back at Ravenswood to find Julian pacing the entrance hall, clearly having discovered her absence and grown anxious in her absence. His face flooded with relief the moment he saw her, followed quickly by concern. "Where have you been? I searched everywhere. I feared." "I went to see the clergyman," Clara said, holding up her notes. "Julian, I have proof. He kept a private ledger, separate from the official register. Edmund altered the church's official book, but he could not touch this." Julian stared at the evidence in her hands, and something in his expression cracked open, relief and shame mingling together. "Clara, I am so sorry. For the doubt you saw in my eyes last night, it was never truly about you. It was about how skillfully Edmund manipulates every situation, how he has spent years teaching me not to trust easily. I should never have let that shadow fall on you, even for a moment." Clara studied him, her hurt from the previous night still tender, but softened now by the evident sincerity in his apology. "I understand the instinct," she said carefully. "But Julian, if we are to survive whatever Edmund throws at us next, I need to know you stand beside me completely, without hesitation, even when the evidence he presents seems convincing at first glance." "You have that," Julian said firmly, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "Completely, and without reservation. I promise you, Clara, I will not let doubt divide us again." Before Clara could respond, a footman appeared at the edge of the hall, his expression troubled. "Your Grace, a letter has arrived, from London. It concerns Miss Fenwick's father's house." Clara's stomach dropped as she took the letter, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. The message was brief but chilling, informing her that the landlord had received a substantial offer to reclaim the property immediately, an offer made anonymously, far above what the modest house was actually worth, with strong pressure attached to accept quickly or risk losing any compensation entirely. "He means to force my family out," Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Edmund is behind this. I am certain of it." Julian read the letter over her shoulder, his expression darkening. "He is trying to create leverage against you, to threaten what you value most, in hopes of forcing some concession from us." "My father is still recovering," Clara said, fear creeping into her voice despite her effort to remain steady. "If they are forced from their home now, in the middle of his treatment." "That will not happen," Julian said firmly. "I will send word immediately. Purchase the property outright if necessary. Ensure your family's home cannot be threatened by anyone, Edmund included. But Clara, this confirms what we already suspected. He is growing desperate, which means he believes we are close to uncovering something that could truly ruin him." Clara took a steadying breath, forcing her fear back into determination. "Then we should not wait any longer. We have Eleanor's letter, proof of his hand in destroying your first engagement. We have the clergyman's private ledger, proof he tampered with our marriage register. It is time we stopped merely defending ourselves and confronted him directly, before he finds some new way to threaten the people we love." Julian's expression hardened with fresh resolve, the earlier doubt and uncertainty burning away into something far more purposeful. "Agreed. We will not give him the chance to strike first again." The days that followed passed in careful, deliberate preparation. Julian secured his solicitor's full attention, gathering formal statements from the clergyman regarding the tampered register, while Clara wrote to Eleanor, requesting permission to present her letter as evidence should matters require it. Eleanor responded within days, granting full permission, along with a brief note expressing her hope that the truth might finally bring Edmund's schemes to a permanent end. Meanwhile, Julian moved swiftly to secure Clara's family home, purchasing the property outright through his solicitor before Edmund's anonymous pressure could take effect. Word came from London that her father's health continued improving steadily, that Alice had grown fond of her new tutor, that her brother had taken quickly to riding lessons, arranged as part of his education. Each piece of good news steadied Clara's resolve, reminding her precisely what she was fighting to protect. Yet even as they prepared their case, Edmund did not remain idle. Rumors continued spreading through society regarding the supposedly irregular marriage documents, and Clara noticed increasingly cool receptions whenever she and Julian appeared in public, whispered conversations that halted abruptly at their approach, invitations that grew noticeably scarcer than before. It became clear that Edmund intended to win this battle not through direct confrontation, but through the slow, corrosive power of doubt and social exclusion. "We cannot simply wait for another chance encounter to expose him," Julian said one evening, as they reviewed their gathered evidence once more in his study. "We need a setting where the truth can be presented clearly, publicly, before enough witnesses that Edmund cannot simply dismiss it as baseless accusation. Lord and Lady Ashcombe are hosting another gathering next week," Clara said thoughtfully. "A larger one, I understand, marking the end of the social season. Most of the same families who witnessed Edmund's accusations that first night would likely be present again." "Then that shall be our moment," Julian said, determination hardening his features. "We confront him there, with Eleanor's letter and the clergyman's ledger as proof, in front of the very people he has been working to turn against us." Julian's solicitor, a careful, methodical man named Mr. Grantham, reviewed every piece of evidence with meticulous attention before offering his assessment. He examined the clergyman's private ledger alongside the official register, comparing signatures and dates with a magnifying glass and evident expertise, before finally setting the documents down with a satisfied nod. "This is compelling evidence, Your Grace," Mr. Grantham said. "The discrepancy between the private ledger and the official register is clear enough that any reasonable authority would recognize tampering has occurred. Combined with Lady Pemberton's letter and her willingness to testify to its origin, I believe you have more than sufficient grounds to expose Mr. Ashby's scheme, both publicly and, if necessary, through formal legal channels." "What of consequences beyond social exposure?" Clara asked. "Could Edmund face genuine legal repercussions for tampering with church records?" "Tampering with an official parish register is a serious offense," Mr. Grantham confirmed. "Should you choose to pursue formal charges, it is entirely possible Mr. Ashby could face significant legal consequences, beyond mere social disgrace. Though I would note, Your Grace, that public exposure alone is often sufficient to end a man's influence entirely within society, particularly a man who has built his standing so heavily upon the good opinion of others." Julian considered this carefully. "I have no particular desire to see my cousin imprisoned, whatever his crimes against us. I would rather see him stripped permanently of any claim to Ravenswood, and any capacity to threaten those I care about, than pursue punishment purely for its own sake." "A reasonable position," Mr. Grantham agreed. "Public exposure, combined with the clear evidence you now possess, should accomplish precisely that. Society tends to be its own judge and jury in matters of reputation, often more thoroughly than any court could manage." With their legal footing confirmed, Clara and Julian spent the following days finalizing their approach, deciding precisely how and when to present their evidence for maximum, undeniable effect. Clara wrote again to Eleanor, this time asking whether she might be willing to appear in person should the confrontation occur at a public gathering, rather than relying solely on her written testimony. Eleanor's response arrived within 2 days, filled with fierce, determined resolve. "I have spent years believing myself simply unlucky in matters of the heart," she wrote, "when in truth, I was deliberately deceived by a man seeking to secure his own ambitions at my expense, and at yours. I will gladly stand beside you both when the moment comes." Edmund Ashby has hidden behind other people's silence for far too long. Clara felt a fierce surge of gratitude reading those words, recognizing in Eleanor a kindred determination, a woman who had suffered quietly for years and was finally ready to reclaim her own story from the shadows of Edmund's manipulation. Meanwhile, Letters continued arriving from London, with news of her family, each one a small anchor of hope amid the tension building toward the coming confrontation. Her father wrote that he had taken his first unassisted walk through the garden in over a year, his handwriting steadier than it had been in months. Alice's letters grew longer and more animated with each passing week, filled with excited descriptions of her lessons and the small kindnesses shown to her by the tutor Julian had arranged. Her brother wrote proudly of his growing skill on horseback, promising to show Clara everything he had learned when next she visited. These small, steady proofs of her family's improving fortunes strengthened Clara's resolve considerably during the anxious week of waiting. Whatever Edmund attempted next, whatever social consequences they might face in the short term, she had already secured what mattered most, the safety and well-being of the people she loved. That certainty gave her a foundation of calm that carried her steadily through the mounting tension. The week that followed passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing fresh whispers, fresh cold glances from acquaintances who had once seemed genuinely welcoming. Clara held her composure through it all, drawing strength from the knowledge that vindication was close at hand, though the strain of waiting tested her resolve more than she cared to admit. On the evening of the gathering, Clara dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that made her feel strong and certain rather than merely presentable. Julian met her in the entrance hall, his own formal attire immaculate, though nothing could fully mask the tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. "I have been ready since the moment I found that clergyman's ledger," Clara said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Edmund has spent years believing he could manipulate the truth to suit his own ambitions. Tonight, we remind him that truth has a way of surfacing regardless of how carefully one tries to bury it." The Ashcombe estate blazed even more brilliantly than before, the ballroom filled nearly to capacity, with London's finest families gathered for the season's final celebration. Clara felt the weight of curious, calculating stares the moment they entered, whispers rippling through the crowd, exactly as they had before, though this time, she met every glance with steady, unbothered confidence, rather than nervous uncertainty. They found Edmund near the refreshment table, holding court among a small circle of eager listeners, clearly enjoying the social currency his rumors had purchased him over recent weeks. His smile faltered only slightly as Julian and Clara approached directly, rather than avoiding him, as they had at previous encounters. "Cousin," Edmund said, recovering his composure quickly. "Duchess, how lovely you both look this evening, despite everything currently being said about your marriage." "That is precisely what we have come to discuss," Julian said, his voice carrying just far enough to draw attention from nearby guests, exactly as Edmund had done to them weeks before. "The rumors you have been so diligently spreading regarding the legitimacy of our marriage." A hush began to fall over the immediate area as more guests turned to observe the exchange, sensing the tension crackling between the two men. Edmund's eyes flickered briefly with something like alarm, before smoothing back into practiced amusement. "I merely repeat what concerns have reached my ears," Edmund said. "I have no personal stake in the matter." "No personal stake," Julian repeated, his voice hardening. "And yet you were the one who visited the clergyman who performed our ceremony, requesting private access to the marriage register, under false pretenses. You were the one who altered the witness names recorded in that official document." Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd, and Edmund's composure cracked visibly for the first time, his eyes darting toward the growing audience. "That is a baseless accusation. You have no proof of any such thing." "On the contrary," Clara said, stepping forward and producing the copied ledger entry she had carried carefully throughout the evening. "The clergyman keeps a private ledger, separate from the official register, recording every ceremony he performs. He has confirmed, in writing, that you requested private access to alter the official book. The true witnesses that night, recorded faithfully in his personal record, were 2 footmen employed at Ravenswood, not the names you fabricated to cast doubt on our marriage." Edmund's face paled as murmurs grew louder around them, guests leaning in with open curiosity now, rather than polite discretion. "This is absurd. Some clerk's private notes prove nothing definitive. Perhaps not on its own," Julian said, "but combined with this." He produced Eleanor's letter, unfolding it carefully for the gathered crowd to see, though he did not release it from his grip. This letter was sent to Lady Eleanor Pemberton, formerly Lady Eleanor Vance, 3 weeks before our engagement was to be finalized, years ago. It contains false accusations, designed specifically to end that engagement. Lady Pemberton has confirmed, in writing, that she received this letter shortly before breaking our engagement, and has granted me permission to present it publicly tonight. He turned the letter slightly, revealing the handwriting to those close enough to observe it clearly. I would ask anyone here familiar with my cousin's correspondence to examine this handwriting closely. I believe you will find it matches his hand precisely. A ripple of shocked recognition moved through several guests who had clearly received letters from Edmund over the years. Whispered confirmations spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Edmund's carefully constructed composure shattered entirely, his face flushing with a mixture of fury and panic. "This proves nothing," he snapped, his voice losing its earlier smooth confidence. "Handwriting can be imitated. This is clearly some scheme concocted between the two of you to discredit me." "Is it?" A new voice cut through the crowd, and Clara turned to see Eleanor herself approaching, having apparently arrived at the gathering despite Clara's assumption she would remain at her own estate. "I received that letter myself, Edmund. I have carried the weight of believing Julian betrayed me for years, only to learn recently that you fabricated the entire accusation to secure your own position within the family. I would be delighted to confirm every detail of this scheme before whatever authority proves necessary." The crowd's attention swung fully toward Edmund now, whispers turning into open, astonished conversation, as the full scope of his deception became clear to everyone present. Lord Ashcombe himself approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Ashby," he said formally, "these are serious accusations, supported by considerable evidence. I would suggest you have a great deal to answer for, both to your family and potentially to the proper authorities, regarding tampered church records." Edmund's eyes darted around the circle of faces surrounding him, finding no sympathy, no support, only cold, judging stares from people who had, until moments before, been perfectly willing to entertain his rumors. Something in him seemed to collapse under the weight of total exposure, his shoulders sagging, his carefully maintained arrogance crumbling into desperate anger. "You have no idea what it has been like," he snarled, turning on Julian with raw, unguarded fury. "Watching you inherit everything, simply because of the order of your birth, while I was left to scrape for scraps of influence, dependent entirely on your father's occasional generosity. I deserved better than what fate handed me." "You deserved nothing that required destroying other people's lives to obtain," Julian said, his voice steady, despite the visible anger simmering beneath his composure. "Eleanor spent years believing herself betrayed, grieving a love she thought had proven false, because of your lies. Clara's family was nearly forced from their home through your manipulation. You have caused genuine harm to people who never wronged you, purely to serve your own ambitions." Edmund had no response to that, his fury draining into something more like defeat as he registered the full weight of judgment surrounding him. Lord Ashcombe gestured quietly to 2 footmen, who moved to escort Edmund from the gathering with as much discretion as the situation still allowed. "This is not finished," Edmund hissed as he was led away. "I will not simply disappear quietly." "Perhaps not," Julian said calmly. "But you will no longer do so from within my household, nor with any claim upon my estate. Whatever legal consequences follow from tampering with church records and fabricating documents to deceive innocent people, you will face them without my protection." The ballroom remained hushed for a long moment after Edmund's departure, before conversation slowly resumed, though now filled with sympathetic glances toward Clara and Julian, rather than suspicious whispers. Eleanor approached, taking Clara's hands warmly in her own. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for finally bringing this into the light. I have carried this grief for far too long, believing myself simply unlucky in love, when the truth was so much crueler, and so much more deliberate." "Thank you for trusting us with your letter," Clara replied. "Without your courage in coming forward tonight, Edmund might have continued believing himself untouchable." As the gathering slowly returned to its usual rhythm of music and conversation, Julian drew Clara aside toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, his expression softening from the hard determination he had carried throughout the confrontation into something warmer, more vulnerable. "We did it," he said quietly. "Together, exactly as you insisted we should." "We did," Clara agreed, relief washing through her so completely that her hands trembled slightly. "It is finally over." "Not entirely," Julian said, taking her trembling hands gently in his own. "There remains one more thing I wish to say, now that the threat hanging over us has finally lifted." Clara looked up at him, searching his face, and found none of the careful reserve he had carried since the night they first met. "What is it?" "I married you out of desperate necessity," Julian said softly, believing our arrangement would remain purely practical, a solution to a legal problem, and nothing more. I did not expect, in the weeks since, to find myself falling genuinely, completely in love with the remarkable woman I married. I did not expect you to become the person whose steady presence I have come to depend upon more than I ever thought I would depend on anyone. Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding, with a hope she had not quite allowed herself to fully acknowledge, until this very moment. "Julian, I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the full weight of everything they had endured together over the preceding weeks. "Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for what you have done to protect this family and this estate, but simply because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I cannot imagine my life without you standing beside me." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, though this time they carried nothing but joy. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling with the truth of it. "I did not expect it either, not from a marriage that began with a stranger's desperate knock at midnight. But somewhere between that first frightened night and this moment, you became essential to me, Julian, in ways I never anticipated." He drew her closer, his hand cupping her face gently, and for the first time since their hurried wedding vows, they kissed, not out of necessity or performance for watching eyes, but out of genuine, hard-won love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something neither of them intended to ever let go of again. The weeks following the confrontation at the Ashcombe estate brought a kind of peace to Ravenswood that Clara had not fully believed possible when she first arrived, as a frightened, uncertain bride. Edmund had quietly departed the county entirely, his social standing thoroughly ruined, his ambitions toward the Ravenswood title permanently extinguished. Julian's solicitor confirmed that formal legal proceedings regarding the tampered church records remained possible should Edmund attempt any further scheming, a quiet insurance policy neither of them expected to need, but one that offered lasting reassurance nonetheless. Clara settled fully into her role as Duchess of Ravenswood, no longer the uncertain stranger who had arrived that first misty morning, but a woman who had earned the genuine respect of the household staff, the tenant families, and increasingly, the broader society that had once regarded her with such wary curiosity. Mrs. Whitfield, who had watched Clara's steady transformation with quiet approval, began treating her less as a subject to be managed, and more as a genuine partner in running the vast estate. "You have done remarkably well, Your Grace," the housekeeper said one afternoon, as they reviewed preparations for an upcoming harvest celebration for the estate's tenant families. "I confess, I did not expect such a swift, hasty marriage to prove so genuinely happy an arrangement." "Neither did I," Clara admitted, smiling. "Though I have learned that the best foundations are not always the ones we plan for carefully in advance." Julian, for his part, found himself a changed man in the months following their marriage, the guarded reserve he had carried since Eleanor's betrayal finally softening into genuine warmth and openness. He laughed more freely, Clara noticed, teased the household staff with an easy humor that clearly delighted them, and no longer carried himself with the careful, watchful tension that had marked their earliest days together. Word arrived from London that Clara's father had made a full recovery, his cough entirely gone, his strength returned enough that he insisted on traveling to Ravenswood himself to see his daughter's new home, rather than waiting for her to visit London again. Clara could hardly contain her joy the day his carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, rushing down the front steps before the footman could even properly announce his arrival. "Papa!" she called, embracing him fiercely as he stepped down from the carriage, looking healthier and stronger than she had seen him in years. "My dear girl," her father said, holding her close. "Look at you. A duchess, no less. I still can hardly believe the stories Alice writes me in her letters." "Come inside," Clara said, laughing through happy tears. "There is so much I want to show you." Alice and her brother tumbled out of the carriage behind their father, both grown noticeably in the months since Clara had last seen them. Alice chattering excitedly about her lessons, her brother eager to show off the writing skills he had been so proud of in his letters. Julian greeted them all warmly, and Clara felt her heart swell watching him kneel down to speak seriously with her young brother about the horses stabled at Ravenswood, treating the boy's eager questions with genuine patience and interest. "He is a fine man, your husband," her father said quietly, watching the scene with evident approval. "I confess, when Alice first wrote to tell me of your sudden marriage, I feared the worst. A duke arriving in the middle of the night, a wedding conducted before dawn. It sounded like the beginning of a very troubling story." "It very nearly was," Clara admitted. "But it became something else entirely, something I would not trade for any careful, conventional courtship." Her father studied her closely, searching her face with the particular attentiveness only a father seemed to possess. "You truly love him." "I do," Clara said simply, "more than I ever expected to, given how it all began." "Then I am glad," her father said, "that whatever desperate circumstance brought you together, it led you here, to genuine happiness. That is all I ever wanted for you, my dear. Security, yes, but happiness above all else." News of Edmund eventually reached them through Mr. Grantham, who reported that he had attempted to settle in a distant county, hoping to rebuild some semblance of standing far from the scandal that had followed him out of London society. His reputation, however, had traveled faster than he had, and he found himself met with the same cold reception everywhere he turned, society having little patience for a man exposed so thoroughly as a schemer willing to forge documents and manipulate innocent lives for his own gain. "He will not trouble you again, Your Grace," Mr. Grantham assured Julian, during one of his periodic visits to review estate matters. "Whatever ambitions he once held toward Ravenswood have been thoroughly and permanently extinguished. I dare say he has learned, rather too late, that reputation, once lost through such deliberate deception, proves exceedingly difficult to rebuild." Julian received the news with quiet satisfaction, rather than any lingering anger. "I hold no particular wish to see him suffer further," he said. "I only wanted him incapable of causing further harm to the people I love. It seems that has been thoroughly accomplished. With Edmund's shadow finally and permanently lifted, life at Ravenswood settled into a warm, steady rhythm that Clara treasured more with each passing week. She continued expanding her responsibilities within the household, eventually taking over full management of the estate's charitable efforts among the tenant families, organizing support for struggling households, arranging proper schooling for children who might otherwise have gone without, drawing on her own experience of hardship to ensure no family under Ravenswood's care suffered needlessly. Julian, meanwhile, found himself increasingly seeking her counsel on estate matters beyond the household's domestic concerns, valuing her practical wisdom and steady judgment on questions ranging from tenant disputes to long-term investments in the estate's future. Their partnership deepened steadily, built not merely on the romantic affection that had blossomed between them, but on a genuine mutual respect for each other's capabilities and judgment. "You have a gift for seeing straight to the heart of a problem," Julian told her one evening, after she had suggested a solution to a long-standing dispute between two tenant farmers that his steward had struggled to resolve for months. "I begin to think Ravenswood is fortunate you agreed to my rather desperate proposal that first night." "I begin to think," Clara replied, smiling, "that we were fortunate for each other, in ways neither of us could have predicted." Her father's visit that followed brought its own quiet joys, evenings spent in comfortable conversation before the fire, her father regaling Julian with stories of Clara's childhood stubbornness, her fierce protectiveness over Alice and their brother even from a young age, qualities that had clearly served her well in the unexpected circumstances of her marriage. Julian listened to every story with genuine delight, clearly cherishing this glimpse into the woman Clara had been before fate brought her to his desperate doorstep. "She never did know how to back down from a challenge," her father said fondly, watching Clara laugh at something Alice had said across the room. "Even as a small girl, if she believed something was right, no amount of difficulty would convince her to abandon it." "That has proven true in my experience as well," Julian said warmly. "I confess, it is one of the qualities I admire most in her." The harvest celebration, held some weeks later, drew tenant families from across the estate, filling the grounds with music, laughter, and the warm glow of lanterns strung between the trees as evening fell. Clara moved among the gathered families with easy familiarity now, having spent months learning their names, their small joys and struggles, earning a genuine affection from the people whose livelihoods depended on the estate's careful management. Julian found her near the edge of the celebration, watching a group of children chase each other through the gathering dusk, their laughter carrying on the cool evening air. He slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "A year ago," he said quietly, "I stood in this exact spot, dreading the arrival of my 30th birthday, certain my father's ridiculous condition would cost me everything I had spent years working to protect. I never imagined it would instead give me the one thing I did not even know I was missing." Clara leaned into him, watching the warm scene spread before them. The estate she had come to genuinely love, the people who had welcomed her so fully into their lives, the man beside her who had transformed from a desperate stranger into the very center of her world. "I have been thinking," Julian continued, "that perhaps we should mark this anniversary properly, not simply as a reminder of the desperate circumstances that first brought us together, but as a celebration of everything we have built since. A renewal of our vows, perhaps, spoken not out of necessity this time, but entirely out of choice." Clara turned to look at him, joy blooming warmly in her chest. "I would like that very much." They held the small ceremony some weeks later, in the same modest church where they had first exchanged hurried vows before dawn, though this time the church overflowed with genuine guests, rather than hastily gathered witnesses. Clara's father walked her down the short aisle, Alice and her brother watching with delighted excitement from the front pew, Eleanor seated warmly beside Mrs. Whitfield, both women who had become genuine friends through the trials of the preceding months. Julian waited at the altar, dressed simply but elegantly, his expression carrying none of the desperate urgency of their first ceremony, only steady, radiant joy as Clara approached. The clergyman, the very same elderly man who had kept the private ledger that ultimately exposed Edmund's deception, presided over the ceremony with evident pleasure at witnessing its happy conclusion. "We gather today," he began, "not out of necessity, but out of genuine, hard-won love, to witness the renewal of vows between Julian Ashby, Duke of Ravenswood, and Clara Ashby, Duchess of Ravenswood." As they spoke their vows once more, this time slowly, deliberately, each word chosen and meant with full understanding of everything they had endured together, Clara felt none of the trembling uncertainty of their first ceremony. Instead, she felt only steady, complete certainty, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a desperate midnight knock and had grown, through trial and difficulty, into a partnership built on genuine trust, respect, and love. "I, Julian Ashby, take thee, Clara, to be my beloved wife," he said, his voice steady and warm, not out of desperate necessity, but out of complete and willing devotion. "I promise to stand beside you always, to trust you fully, and to love you more with each passing year, exactly as I have come to love you these past months." Clara repeated her own vows in turn, her voice clear and certain, carrying none of the fear that had marked her first wedding night. "I, Clara, take thee, Julian, to be my beloved husband, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love freely given. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges may come, to trust you completely, and to build with you a life filled with the same warmth and devotion you have shown me since the very beginning." When the clergyman finally pronounced them husband and wife once more, the small church erupted into genuine applause and joyful cheers, so different from the hushed, uncertain silence of their first ceremony. Julian kissed her tenderly before their gathered friends and family, and Clara felt, in that moment, a complete and overwhelming sense of belonging that she had never quite dared to hope for during those desperate early days. They celebrated afterward at Ravenswood, the estate grounds filled with music and laughter, tenant families mingling freely with London society, all gathered to celebrate a marriage that had defied every expectation of how such arrangements were supposed to unfold. Clara danced with her father, laughed with Alice over some small joke, watched her brother attempt an ambitious dance step that sent several onlookers into delighted laughter, and finally found herself back in Julian's arms as evening settled fully over the celebration. "Any regrets?" Julian asked softly, as they swayed together beneath the lantern light. "About that desperate night? About everything that followed?" "Not a single one," Clara said, resting her head against his shoulder. "You knocked on my door needing a wife by tomorrow, and I gave you my conditions. I never imagined those conditions would lead me here, to a life so completely different from anything I dared to dream of before." "Nor did I," Julian admitted, holding her closer. "I came to your door seeking a solution to a legal problem. I found, instead, the truest partnership I have ever known, and a love I did not believe myself capable of feeling again, after everything with Eleanor." "Then perhaps," Clara said, smiling up at him, "your father's ridiculous condition was not so ridiculous after all. Perhaps it simply forced you toward exactly the life you were always meant to find." Julian laughed, the warm, unguarded sound that had become so familiar to her over the preceding months, and kissed her gently beneath the stars scattered across the clear evening sky. Around them, the estate continued its joyful celebration, tenant families and society guests alike toasting the happiness of their Duke and Duchess, a marriage that had begun with desperate necessity and conditions carefully negotiated at midnight, and had grown, through trial and genuine devotion, into a love story neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure completely. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed into the cool night air, Julian and Clara walked slowly through the quiet gardens together, hand in hand. The weight of everything they had endured finally settled into peaceful contentment. Ravenswood stood behind them, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness, no longer merely an estate to be protected from Edmund's ambitions, but a genuine home, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine on that rainy midnight when a desperate duke first knocked on a stranger's door. "Whatever comes next," Clara said softly, "I am glad it is you standing beside me." "Always," Julian promised, drawing her close beneath the star-filled sky. "For as long as I live, Clara, you will never again face anything alone." And as they walked back toward the warm lights of Ravenswood together, both of them understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever conditions had first bound them together, what remained now was simply, completely, and enduringly love. In the seasons that followed, Ravenswood continued to flourish under their shared care, the estate's tenant families prospering, under policies Clara helped shape with her own hard-earned understanding of hardship and resilience. Alice grew into a bright, confident young woman, under the tutoring Julian had arranged, eventually expressing interest in continuing her studies further than most young women of her station were typically permitted, an ambition Clara and Julian both wholeheartedly supported. Her brother thrived at Ravenswood, spending long afternoons in the stables, developing a genuine talent for horsemanship that Julian took particular pride in nurturing. Clara's father remained a frequent visitor, his health steady and strong, delighting in watching his daughter's transformation, from a struggling young woman managing crisis after crisis, to a confident, capable duchess, respected throughout the county for her fairness and genuine care for those under her protection. He often remarked, during quiet evenings by the fire, that he had never imagined such happiness could emerge from such a frightening, uncertain beginning. Eleanor visited often as well, her own friendship with Clara deepening steadily, beyond the shared trial that had first brought them together. She eventually found genuine happiness in her own marriage to Lord Pemberton. The shadow of Edmund's old deception finally lifted enough that she could look back on those painful years without the lingering grief that had once colored every memory of her broken engagement to Julian. Mrs. Whitfield remained a steady, trusted presence within the household, her early wariness toward the hastily arranged marriage long since transformed into genuine devotion toward the Duchess, who had earned her respect through patient, honest effort, rather than simply expecting deference owed to her title. She often told the younger staff, with evident pride, that she had known from that very first morning, watching Clara step down from the carriage with quiet composure, despite her obvious nerves, that Ravenswood had finally found a duchess worthy of the name. Julian and Clara continued to face the ordinary challenges of managing a great estate together, disagreements occasionally arising over decisions large and small, but always resolved through the same honest, direct communication that had carried them safely through Edmund's schemes. Theirs remained a partnership built on genuine equality, each valuing the other's judgment, each grateful for a marriage that had begun in desperate necessity, but had grown into something neither of them had ever expected to find, a true and lasting love, chosen freely and treasured completely, exactly as it deserved to be. 2 years after the harvest celebration that marked their renewed vows, a letter arrived at Ravenswood that would test the peace Clara and Julian had built together in a way neither of them expected. It came from a solicitor in a distant county, addressed formally to the Duke of Ravenswood, informing him that Edmund Ashby had fallen gravely ill, with little expectation of recovery, and had expressed a wish to speak with Julian before the end came, if he was willing to make the journey. Clara watched Julian read the letter twice, his expression unreadable, before he finally set it down on his desk and looked up at her. "I do not know what to feel," he admitted. "Anger, still, for everything he did to us, to Eleanor, to your family. And yet, he is still my cousin. We played together as boys, before ambition and jealousy poisoned whatever affection once existed between us." "What does your heart tell you to do?" Clara asked gently, settling into the chair across from his desk. Julian was quiet for a long moment. "I think I need to see him, not for his sake alone, but for my own. I do not wish to carry unresolved anger for the rest of my life, nor do I wish to wonder, after he is gone, whether I might have found some way to offer peace before the end." "Then I will come with you," Clara said firmly. "Whatever waits at the end of that journey, you should not face it alone." They traveled together to the modest house where Edmund had spent his final years, far removed from the grand ambitions that had once driven him to such desperate scheming. He was thin and pale when they arrived, his once proud bearing reduced by illness to something frail and diminished, propped up against pillows in a small, sparsely furnished room. "I did not expect you to actually come," Edmund said, his voice weak but carrying a trace of the dry humor Clara remembered from their earliest, tension-filled encounters at Ravenswood. "Neither did I, if I am honest," Julian admitted, settling into a chair beside the bed, while Clara remained standing near the doorway, uncertain of her place in this final reckoning between cousins. "I owe you an apology," Edmund said, his eyes finding Julian's with unexpected sincerity. "Not merely for the harm I caused, though that alone would warrant it, but for the years I wasted believing that your happiness somehow diminished my own worth. I convinced myself I deserved what should rightfully have been yours, and in doing so, I destroyed whatever chance I had at genuine contentment of my own." Julian studied his cousin's ravaged face, old anger warring with genuine, unexpected sympathy. "You caused real harm, Edmund. Eleanor spent years grieving a betrayal that never happened. Clara's family was nearly forced from their home through your manipulation. Those consequences do not simply vanish because you have found regret at the end of your life." "I know that," Edmund said quietly. "I do not ask forgiveness expecting it to erase what I have done. I only wish to say it plainly, before I no longer had the chance. I am sorry, Julian. Truly and completely sorry, for the pain I caused you, and everyone you love." Clara watched Julian's expression shift slowly from guarded anger toward something softer, more complicated. The particular grief of mourning a relationship that might have been genuine, had ambition and bitterness not corrupted it so thoroughly. "I forgive you," Julian said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because what you did no longer matters, but because I do not wish to carry this anger for the rest of my own life. We were boys together once, before everything else came between us. I choose to remember that, alongside everything that followed." Edmund's eyes filled with tears, his frail hand reaching for Julian's. "Thank you. That is more grace than I deserve." Clara stepped forward then, drawn by some instinct toward compassion, despite everything Edmund had put her family through. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "my father made a full recovery, and my siblings have flourished at Ravenswood, beyond anything I could have hoped for. Whatever harm you intended, it did not ultimately succeed in destroying what mattered most to us. I hope that offers you some small measure of peace." Edmund looked at her with genuine surprise, clearly not expecting such generosity from the woman whose family he had once threatened. "You are a remarkable woman, Duchess. Julian is fortunate to have found you, however unconventional the circumstances." They stayed a while longer, the conversation turning eventually to gentler subjects, childhood memories Julian and Edmund had shared, before rivalry poisoned their bond. Small kindnesses that Edmund's illness seemed to have stripped back to genuine remembrance. When they finally departed, the sun setting low over the unfamiliar countryside, Julian was quiet for a long stretch of the journey home. "I am glad we came," he said finally, as their carriage rolled through the gathering dusk. I did not expect forgiveness to feel the way it does. I thought it might feel like weakness, like excusing what he did. Instead, it feels like setting down a weight I did not realize I was still carrying. Forgiveness rarely means forgetting, Clara said gently, resting her hand over his. It simply means choosing not to let old wounds continue shaping who you become. I am proud of you, Julian, for finding the strength to offer him that peace, even after everything. Edmund passed away 3 weeks later, and Julian, to Clara's quiet admiration, arranged for a modest but respectful burial, attending himself despite the complicated history between them. He returned from the service with a settled, peaceful expression Clara had not seen since long before Edmund's schemes had first disrupted their lives. "It is truly finished now," he said that evening, as they sat together in the quiet study where so much of their early struggle against Edmund had unfolded. Not merely defeated, but finished, in every sense. "I no longer carry any anger toward him, only a quiet sadness for the man he might have become, had jealousy not consumed him so completely." Clara moved to sit beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "You have grown, Julian, in ways I do not think either of us fully anticipated when this all began. The man who knocked on my door that desperate midnight was capable of great determination, but I do not think he yet understood the full measure of grace he was capable of offering, even to those who wronged him most deeply." "I had a remarkable teacher," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You have shown me, time and again, what genuine strength looks like, Clara. Not merely the strength to fight when fighting is necessary, but the strength to forgive when forgiveness serves a greater peace." Their life together continued, in the years that followed, marked not by further crisis or scheming, but by the steady, ordinary joys of a genuine partnership built on hard-won trust. Ravenswood remained prosperous under their careful, compassionate stewardship, its tenant families secure and well cared for, its household staff genuinely devoted to the Duke and Duchess who had proven themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. Clara often thought back, in quiet moments, to that rainy midnight when a desperate stranger had appeared on her doorstep, upending her entire life with a single, urgent proposal. She had agreed then, out of necessity, out of desperate hope for her family's survival, never imagining that arrangement would grow into the deepest, most genuine love she had ever known. Julian, for his part, often remarked that his father's strange, demanding will, which he had once viewed as a cruel trap, had ultimately delivered him the greatest gift of his life, a partner whose strength, wisdom, and genuine goodness had transformed not only his estate, but his entire understanding of what a marriage and a life could truly become. Word of their story spread quietly through society over the following years, whispered not as scandal any longer, but as something closer to legend. The tale of a duke who had knocked on a stranger's door at midnight, and the resolute young woman who had answered with conditions of her own, rather than simple, grateful acceptance. Young women navigating their own uncertain courtships sometimes spoke of Clara with quiet admiration, drawing courage from her example, the knowledge that a woman need not surrender her voice or her dignity, even when circumstances demanded swift, difficult decisions. Mr. Grantham continued serving as the family's trusted solicitor for many years afterward, occasionally remarking, with evident fondness, that he had never handled a more unusual case in all his years of practice, nor one that had resolved so thoroughly and happily, despite its chaotic beginnings. He often told younger colleagues, half in jest, that the Ravenswood marriage stood as proof that the law's strange demands could sometimes lead to outcomes far better than anyone might reasonably have predicted. Clara's brother eventually took up a position managing part of the estate's growing agricultural interests, his early fascination with horses evolving into genuine expertise in the practical business of running a great estate's lands. Alice, true to the ambitions she had nurtured since childhood, pursued further education, with the full support of both Clara and Julian, eventually becoming something of an advocate herself for expanding opportunities available to young women of modest means, drawing inspiration from her own family's unlikely rise in fortune. Clara's father lived many more contented years, watching his grandchildren grow within the walls of Ravenswood, delighting in the life his daughter had built from what had once seemed like an impossible, frightening circumstance. He often told the story of that first note Clara left him, promising she would explain everything soon, and how he had woken that morning to find his daughter gone, and a strange, hurried explanation waiting in her careful handwriting. He always finished the telling with the same warm observation, that whatever fear he had felt that morning had long since transformed into profound gratitude for the life fate had ultimately delivered his family. On quiet evenings, long after the estate had settled into peaceful, contented rhythm, Julian and Clara would sometimes sit together in the garden, where they had first walked as cautious near strangers, watching the sun set over the lands they had come to protect and cherish together. Julian would occasionally reach for her hand, still finding, after so many years, the same quiet comfort in her steady presence that had first drawn him to trust her with his desperate proposal. "Do you ever wonder," Clara asked him once, many years into their marriage, "what might have happened if I had simply closed the door that night and sent you back into the rain?" Julian considered the question seriously, as he considered most things she asked him. "I imagine I would have found some other solution to my father's will, some marriage of pure convenience, with a stranger who remained a stranger, for the rest of our lives together. I would have kept Ravenswood, perhaps, but I do not believe I would have found anything close to genuine happiness." "I am glad I did not close the door then," Clara said softly. "As am I," Julian replied, "more than I could ever fully express. You gave me conditions that night, Clara, conditions I agreed to out of desperate necessity. I did not realize then that in meeting them, I would find not merely a solution to a legal problem, but the truest happiness I have ever known." Their story, which had begun with desperate conditions negotiated at midnight, had grown into something far greater than either of them had dared to hope for that first frightened night, a testament to the idea that even the most unlikely beginnings could blossom into genuine, lasting happiness, when built upon honesty, courage, and a willingness to face every difficulty together rather than apart.